Welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. We are here talking fantasy football in advance of many people drafting this weekend. We are here to help you succeed and claim bragging rights over all your friends. We're joined today by Andy Behrens of Yahoo Sports, Zachariason of Numberfire, and Micah James of FF Magic Man. Thank you all for joining us today, guys. To start, why don't we just go around and everyone say how many leagues you're in this year and how many you think is too many. Andy, why don't you start? All right, and JJ, how about you?
I'm in about 10 fantasy leagues this year, and I don't know what's acceptable necessarily, but for me, 10 seems to be the number that I kind of hover around year in and year out. I would say that most would call me a degenerate as a result, but that's typically the number that I participate in.
All right, and Micah, how about you?
I tried to cut back quite a bit this season, so I'm down to probably 18 or 19. I played in about 30 last year, and that got to be a little bit unwieldy trying to set your rosters and everything. As far as too many, I mean, it's as many as you can handle, I guess. For the average person, probably 3 or 4 is going to be an awful lot to try and keep track of. But like JJ said, some of us are nuts, so bring them on.
All right. Well, certainly no one watching is doubting that you guys are qualified fantasy football lunatics, some would say, at this point. Love the game. Why don't we just start by going over what your general strategy is for drafting going into 2014 this year? Every year the landscape is a little bit different. People seem to be high on a certain group of players or position, and it's always informed by how the last couple of years went. So, JJ, why don't you start and just let us know what your big picture strategy is this year?
Yeah, so I mean, fantasy football is a game that's kind of based in supply and demand and these basic economic principles. You're starting 2 or 3 wide receivers, 2 running backs, and only 1 quarterback and 1 tight end. So I think each year what I seem to do is just keep the same strategy every year, and that's kind of waiting on tight end and waiting on quarterback. And it's really just based on those supply and demand principles. So, this year there are lots of viable quarterbacks, especially late in drafts. So you can wait till the 11th and 12th rounds and still get a guy like Russell Wilson as your QB1, which is just absurd. So, I think that as we kind of shift, and I think more and more leagues are moving to the 2 quarterback format, I think that you're going to naturally start seeing that. But until that happens, I'm going to continue to take my quarterbacks late because really, the position is so replaceable right now because there are so many quarterbacks out there that are dropping back to pass 30-plus times per game. And as a result, you can really take advantage of that in fantasy football.
All right, living up to your Twitter handle there, @LateRoundQB.
Right.
Micah, what are your thoughts on that and your general strategy?
Well, I definitely with JJ when you talk about quarterback position this year especially. It is so deep. You mentioned being able to get Russell Wilson in the 12th or wherever quarterback, and you can even get guys like Robert Griffin III or players that were very highly sought after that drop. So I definitely am a proponent of trying to wait on your quarterback if you can do that. I'm seeing for myself probably less value in the running back position this year than I have in many others. In a lot of my drafts, I'm focusing on wide receiver a little bit earlier perhaps than I have in years past. We've got a maybe fantasy football adage of, draft your stud running backs early, but I think that running back position is evolving to an extent that those stud running backs just really don't exist anymore. And so I'd rather focus on some of the elite receivers where we can count on their production year over year, whereas running backs are so transitory that I've found I'm focusing a little bit more on wide receivers early and trying to fill in some running backs later in the draft.
Interesting. Definitely a good amount of running backs drafted in the first round last year did not end up backing up that high cost. Andy, what about you? Do you agree with what the other two have had to say so far. What's your strategy heading into this year? All right, Andy, it looks like we can't hear you right now. If you could maybe check, I don't know if you're muted on your computer. Sorry about that. And we can try to test that out. Can you try now? All right, we will keep working to try to figure that out. But in the meantime, let's go position by position here. And Micah, you were starting to touch on this, the running back position. Usually the highest priority for everyone in the first round. You said that's maybe not the case for you this year. So what is the reasoning for that? Who are some of the running backs that you're after this year, and who are some people that you're maybe looking to avoid at that position?
Yeah, I think what it boils down to for me is a couple of things when it comes to running back. Now, all of this is going to be league specific. So obviously, if your league is unusual in a way that maybe there's a higher priority on the running back, or it's a deep rostered league, it might change some things. But I think for me, there's probably 5 of the top running backs that form a very specific tier. I mean, it's obviously Jamal Charles, it's LaShawn McCoy, it's Adrian Peterson, Matt Forte, and for me, Eddie Lacy goes into that quintet as well. So, I think you certainly are in a good position with any of those guys, and I wouldn't say don't draft them, but certainly if I'm later in a draft or later in that first round and those 5 are gone, then I'm definitely going to look wide receiver. Even earlier, if it's a league where I have to start 3 wide receivers, I might forego a running back for a Calvin Johnson or maybe even Jimmy Graham, depending upon the league. I think there's guys that you can get later on, and we have players like Rashad Jennings in New York, that now with David Wilson not being there, it certainly looks like he's going to be somebody that has a much greater workload on everything. And then certainly Toby Gerhart, another guy that had been behind Adrian Peterson for a lot of seasons and now gets the primary job in Jacksonville. I think he's somebody that can pay off some dividends. Even some of the backup rookies that are available later, guys like Devontae Freeman in Atlanta, I think has a really good opportunity this season. Carlos Hyde in San Francisco. So, if I get one running back like even an Alfred Morris or maybe a Marshawn Lynch late that I can count on as my primary back and then fill in with some of those other guys later in the draft, I'm good with that. And I like how my teams have come out.
We're going to be taking in a user question now on that note about some of those younger running backs that you mentioned. Andre Ellington definitely showed some flair toward the end of last season. Rashard Mendenhall no longer in Arizona. Do you guys think he's worth a second or third round pick in a 10 or 12 team league, would you say? JJ, why don't you start?
Yeah, he's kind of grown on me as the offseason and the preseason has started. I think with Ellington, that Arizona offense really took a step forward the second half of last season. Carson Palmer, according to some of our advanced analytics that we work with at NumberFire, Carson Palmer was a top 5 quarterback the second half of the season after the bye week hit. I think a lot of that had to do with some growing pains in that Bruce Arians offense for the first half of the season. And they have a lot of star power there. Michael Floyd is a big breakout candidate this year, even though his numbers were actually pretty good last year. Larry Fitzgerald is Larry Fitzgerald. The offensive line, if it can come together and be a cohesive unit, I think there's reason to take a guy like Ellington, in that late second, maybe early third area. And a lot of that now has to do with other running backs ahead of them kind of having question marks around them, whether it's Le'Veon Bell in the potential LeGarrette Blount situation, or Gio Bernard, and someone might not be as high on him because of their selection of Jeremy Hill in the draft. So, I think Ellington is definitely an attractive running back. He has tons of upside in that offense. I don't think that the NFC West defenses are going to be as strong as they were last year necessarily. So I do like Ellington this year.
All right, thank you. Anyone else have thoughts on Ellington? Think maybe he's being overvalued? Andy, what do you think? What are your thoughts on the running back position right now?
Can you hear me? Do you have
Yes,
me?
we can. All right, there he is.
Okay.
Andy Behrens in the
I don't
house.
think I did anything magical there, but I'm glad to be back. I love Ellington. I'm loving the price a little bit less now than I liked it a few weeks ago. I mean, for a while there, I've got him ahead of Le'Veon Bell, and I've had him ahead of Le'Veon Bell, and I've got him kind of in that group with Monte Ball, some of those guys. I mean, he was absolutely spectacular last year. It was 5.5 yards a carry. It was almost 10 yards a reception. It was kind of a ridiculous average for a running back. This guy had like all the splash plays and all the highlights last year. Probably the highlight play of the season was him juking Darrelle Revis to the ground, right? Just a sensational runner. Had, I want to say, over 1,000 scrimmage yards on less than 160 touches. So he doesn't need to get to 300 touches this year to be a great, great back. If he just picks up another 40, 50, 60, this kid's going to be awesome.
All right, Andre Helling, believe the hype. So let's talk about the quarterback position, because this is an area where I feel like there's a lot of disagreement between people. You have people like JJ who say, you can get a solid quarterback in the late round, someone to get you through. But a lot of people look at last year with all the running backs that didn't pan out in the first round, and they say, why would I not take an elite talent like Peyton Manning, Aaron Rodgers, or Drew Brees in the first round, someone who I know is going to be solid week in and week out. So, Andy, let's go back to you since you were gone for so long. What are your thoughts on quarterback? Are you buying any of those guys in the early rounds or no?
Well, so unfortunately, I think you have three experts here who all kind of feel the same way about the position, right? Like in most 10 and 12 team leagues, I'm going to wait. And it's not just because there's one guy that I would target. It's that you can play a platoon in like a 12-man league and end up with, Jay Cutler, the quarterback who's tied to like the league's second highest scoring offense, and maybe Ben Roethlisberger. You can get those guys in the 10th and 11th round. Play matchups all year, and you're going to get something close to equivalent production to one of those elite quarterbacks. The other thing with like Peyton Manning, I mean, it would obviously be silly to bet on him repeating that season, right? That's the thing about career years. The thing about all-time years is that they only happen once in a lifetime, right? There've only been a couple of 50-touchdown seasons, so you can't take a guy like that in the first round and just assume that the numbers are going to repeat. Just assume that an older player has now reached some new historic plateau. You have to figure that he gives back a few numbers. And some of this just comes down to league settings as well. The only situation where I think I would probably draft one of those guys really early is maybe I'm in a two-quarterback league, and the edge that you can get by having a Drew Brees, someone like that, is just too great.
Definitely. So then there are those guys at the top. There are the late-round quarterbacks that a lot of you guys are advocating for. What about those middle-tier players, the Andrew Lucks, the Cam Newtons, the Nick Foles of the world, who you can still get your two stud running backs, stud wide receiver first, but the cost is a little higher for them. Are you guys buying them or still looking to avoid? Micah?
I think you can make a case for probably 8 to 10 quarterbacks behind the top three, and I think we'd all agree probably Manning, Brees, and Rodgers, however you divide those three up or however you'd rank them, are going to be your top three quarterbacks. And probably anybody from number 4, Andrew Luck for a lot of people, Matt Ryan I've seen up there, Matthew Stafford a lot of folks have, all the way down to the Tony Romos and the Jay Cutlers. You can make an argument for any of those quarterbacks finishing as a top 5 player. I don't think there's any way that anybody could argue against that other than we don't know what happens in fantasy football. So while you might love to have a guy like Brees or Aaron Rodgers, and I wouldn't, I guess, argue against anybody if they want that safety, although you look at Rodgers getting hurt last season and he sabotaged a lot of people's teams, there are so many other quarterbacks that I would be very happy with to take as my quarterback 1 that I can get later that, there's no reason to take a guy early. You look at a Jay Cutler, somebody like that, even Nick Foles, as you mentioned, any of those guys could have a top 5 season and pay huge dividends for you.
All right, so the general consensus here is you can wait on quarterback. Let's talk about the tight end position. Very similar in terms of breakdown to the quarterback. You have Jimmy Graham, Rob Gronkowski, and Julius Thomas, most people's clear top 3, the elite group, going in the first 1 to 3 rounds. And then you have a bunch of guys who you can get later. JJ, is it the same for tight end as it is quarterback for you, or is it different?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same. The difference between quarterback and tight end is, you're obviously still starting one tight end and you're starting one quarterback. There are leagues where, you can throw in a tight end in the flex spot. But in general, the supply and demand formula here, I mean, you don't really need tight ends in your fantasy squad. And, the big thing with tight ends, though, that's different than quarterbacks is their week-to-week predictability. So tight ends are much more volatile than quarterbacks are, so it's a little bit more difficult to get later round tight ends or guys off the waiver wire that are going to for sure produce. Whereas at quarterback, everyone's throwing the ball, so it's very easy to see based on sample size that these quarterbacks are going to perform. So that's kind of the edge and the need to get a guy like Jimmy Graham or Rob Gronkowski. The problem that I have for Jimmy Graham is the opportunity cost involved. If you get him in the middle of the first round, you're now foregoing the opportunity to have maybe a guy like Demaryius Thomas who could finish as the number one wide receiver this year, or if Calvin drops, or I've seen Jimmy Graham go in the top 5, and like Micah said earlier, there are legitimate running backs in those top 5 spots. But then with Rob Gronkowski, I like Rob Gronkowski more as a fantasy asset than I do Jimmy Graham. When Rob Gronkowski played last year, he outperformed Jimmy Graham, but the big question mark is Rob Gronkowski going to play? And I don't really think that you can just bank on that right now. I'm not really in love with drafting him in the second round, which is where he's been going of late. But I do think that he has, if he is healthy, he would be the one that would be able to outperform Graham. And then on the flip side, in the late rounds, you have this massive group of potential. You have a guy like Travis Kelce in Kansas City who's he's baby Gronk. You have a guy like Zach Ertz in Philadelphia who could do a lot of work in the red zone. I mean, there are Ladarius Green, Tyler Eifert who could step up for an injured Marvin Jones. I just think that there's tons of talent at tight end, and this could be the year that we kind of see that bubble burst. Those elite tight ends not have the distinct advantage that they've had in years past, because I think that teams are seeing the advantage that you have in having these athletic tight ends, and as a result, they've been drafting them, and you're going to see some of them blow up this year.
All right. Andy, what do you think about the tight end position this year?
Well, if I can add to JJ's point, one of the guys that you mentioned as a top-tier tight end, Julius Thomas, he was drafted in like 15% of Yahoo leagues last year, right? So that was a case where it was a guy who just came not out of nowhere exactly. I mean, if you're drafting late in the season, you knew who he was, you're able to scoop him up. But that was a guy who came off the waiver wire in a ton of leagues, and Kelsey's a strong candidate to do that again this year. I mean, there's always a couple guys at this position. It was Charles Clay last year as well, who wasn't necessarily a top tier guy, but certainly helpful to fantasy owners. There is talent that comes into the player pool at this position that doesn't get drafted. Right? We're not perfectly efficient at drafting all the great tight ends. I am really with JJ on drafting Jimmy Graham in the first round, especially in a deeper league. Like if you're in a 10-man or 12-man league, the opportunity cost with taking Graham is not as high because it's hard to screw up that draft. But if it's a deep league, if it's 16 teams, if it's 20 teams, and you're drafting a tight end in the first round, it's really hard to get talent at the positions where you absolutely have to have talent. It's really hard to fill out your running backs and your wide receivers with like quality fantasy assets. I think that's a little difficult. And I guess if I could say one thing about Gronk here, I'm not going to own him in any leagues. And it's not because he isn't one of the all-time players at his position. It's just this is not, like the Adrian Peterson recovery is probably the worst thing that happened to players trying to rehab ACLs, because the league is littered with guys who do not come back in 8 or 9 months from this, right? Mario Manningham is still trying to come back. Kenny Britt is still trying to come back. I mean, this is still a really tricky injury for somebody who relies on explosion and cutting. And I think your real downside with Gronk is that he actually plays 15 or 16 games, but it's a heroic effort. He finishes with like 800 yards, and he doesn't even come close to justifying his draft position.
Definitely. Micah, what do you think? Are you going for one of those top 3 guys, or do you have any late round tight end guys you like?
They all probably, to me, in the 3rd round, and so sometimes you can get Julius Thomas there, and I will take Thomas if he's available in most leagues if I can find him at that point, because I do think that Denver offense is going to, while Peyton Manning won't repeat what he did last year, that offense is going to be phenomenal. And I think Thomas is a guy that has a great chance to pay off. But beyond that, I think, as the other two have mentioned, there is so much tight end talent that you can get. JJ mentioned Ladarius Green in San Diego. I would counter, don't forget about Antonio Gates. He's not ready to ride off into the sunset just yet. And he's a guy that you can get with almost your very last pick, maybe your second to last pick, and is somebody that can pay huge dividends. Dwayne Allen in Indianapolis, a guy that had a lot of high hopes going into last season, got who could end up being an every week starter for you. So again, I think you've got to look at your find the value is, but waiting on tight end to get.
All right, thank you. So let's move on to now the wide receiver position, which is another deep one. A lot of names being thrown around, but some of the top names: Demaryius Thomas, Calvin Johnson, going as first-round picks. What is your approach for everyone to this position with so many options? Andy, why don't you kick us off on wide receivers?
Well, so the first thing I'd say is I think there's like 20 guys who could lead the position in scoring. I mean, at the top, it's just a great group. There's a lot of talent there. I mean, I look down my list of wide receiver ranks, and I can legitimately find like the guys that I've ranked as a wide receiver too. I would not be shocked at all if they led the position in scoring. It's great. To go back to something that I think we said at the top of the show, that back half of the first round, after the top 5 running backs are gone, and as we start looking at other positions, I love a run on the elite wide receivers there, right? Because we have several guys who over multiple seasons have given you like 1,400 yards, 12 to 14 touchdowns, and that is bankable production. So it's not just Calvin Johnson, it's Dez Bryant, and it's AJ, and it's Demaryius Thomas, and you can throw Brandon Marshall in there. There's potential with Julio Jones, a guy who I think was leading the position in fantasy scoring last year before the injury. Throw him in that group as well. That is bankable production. They've done it many times, and I like seeing maybe 5 or 6 wide receivers go at the tail end of the first round, because we get into that sketchy group of running backs where maybe they pop and maybe they don't, but maybe I like the guys I can get in the 4th round as much as the guys I can get in the 1st round. So I do think that the elite wide receivers need to go that high, even in standard leagues. I'm not going to use the PPR excuse here. I mean, even in standard leagues, I think the best wide receivers need to go at the top.
Micah, who are you looking to get at wide receiver this year?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of guys, obviously, and in many cases, it just sort of depends who's available at what spot. I like Brandon Marshall an awful lot in that upper level of are taking the Dez Bryants and the AJ Greens. I think Alshon Jeffrey is another at the top. Any of that Bears offense with what Trestman's going to do throwing, I think is great to own. Some of those maybe lower guys, that I have that I think are well primed. I think people are maybe discounting Julian Edelman a little bit. I know that certainly a lot of what he did last season was because Gronk wasn't there for the majority of it. But even when Gronk was on the field, Edelman was still the primary wide receiving target. And so put in some guys are great. Help. Certainly Andre Johnson is another guy that is falling because of some of the offseason issues. They don't have much going on in Houston, and Andre Johnson should be another wide receiver that pays pretty big dividends for you.
All right, let's talk about someone who was, at one point, an elite wide receiver talent, Kenny Britt. Michael Worthington asks us, Kenny Britt is a wide receiver 1, yet his ADP is around 133. If he stays out of trouble, can he put up wide receiver 1 fantasy points, or are the haters correct and no longer trusting him? JJ, why don't you start us off, and then anyone else can jump in on this.
I mean, I think it's kind of hard to trust him. I'm fine with him, as a flyer, but at the same time, that offense isn't really built for wide receivers to just blow up. I mean, it's a pretty conservative offense from a passing perspective. Sam Bradford hasn't shown that he can support a top-tier wide receiver, which is a big thing for him. They have multiple weapons there that are, I should say, multiple mediocre to potentially weapons there. I'm not a big Tavon fan. Brian Quick has had good camp reports, but there's just a lot of ambiguity there that I think that's part of the reason that Kenny Britt has dropped. He hasn't been healthy throughout his entire career. It's kind of hard to trust him at this point. It's kind of ironic that he's getting passes thrown to him from Sam Bradford, who also hasn't been able to stay healthy throughout his career. So, I'm kind of staying away from that situation, that passing game in general. I don't like trusting Brian Schottenheimer with anything.
Anyone else? Kenny Britt, like him as a flyer, or not trusting him still?
Well, I guess I would say that if you can get him at pick 130, that's fine as a flyer. But I would just I would underscore everything JJ said about that being kind of a spin the wheel offense, right? I mean, last year Tavon would have a week and Jared Cook would have a week, but nobody strung together productive weeks, and you kind of feel like if things go according to game plan for that team, it's going to be defense and it's going to be Zach Stacy.
Right.
All right. Let's move on to some.
Yeah, one guy in that St. Louis.
Sorry, Micah, you go ahead.
I said one guy that people might want to keep an eye on. He's suspended for the first 4 weeks, but keep an eye on your waiver wire daily because he's probably the most season value for your team. So just keep an eye out on him.
All right, thank you. Let's keep going on that note, and let's get into some late round sleepers, the guys who you can get in the last rounds when a lot of people are sort of going through the motions, and you can maybe land a steal that wins you the league. So we'll run down the list and just give me a few names at whatever position that you're hoping to target in those late rounds. JJ, why don't you start?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on. I'm just going to throw this guy out there because I feel like I need to promote him a little bit. But Justin Hunter is a guy that you should be targeting in fantasy this year. I'm a huge fan. He's already. I mean, his ADP is rising. I understand he's like a 10th round pick now, but for smaller leagues, he's going to be going late. I got him super late in the draft that I did the other day, and the reason for that is mostly he's a touchdown scorer, and that offense doesn't really have a touchdown scorer. Kendall Wright has 158 career receptions, and he has 6 touchdowns. And the other thing is that Jake Locker is coming in to play quarterback for Tennessee, and he's going to throw the ball downfield a lot more than Ryan Fitzpatrick did. Ryan Fitzpatrick had a very, very low average depth of target. Ryan Fitzpatrick loved throwing to Delaney Walker and the tight ends kind of closer to the line of scrimmage. And Justin Hunter last year in his rookie season had 4 touchdowns on 18 catches, and he's already showing you what he's capable of doing in the preseason. So I love Justin Hunter. Just had to throw it out there just because I think that he has potential to be a legitimate wide receiver too, especially if you're in a standard league where point per reception stuff doesn't really matter and receptions don't matter as much. Another guy that I'm kind of looking at, and it's kind of crazy, and it's just a flyer, and I know that we just talked down Kenny Britt due to injury, but Jonathan Stewart is in an interesting situation as well in Carolina. I mean, he came out with a great preseason game in his last outing. D'Angelo Williams is a grandpa according to running back age. I think that offense in general is going to run the football. And Jonathan Stewart is a very, very talented back, and we all know that. It's just that he hasn't been able to stay healthy. So if it's a flyer, sure, I'm not going to trust him as an RB2 or even an RB3. I'm just getting him for depth. But he has that upside, and when you're late in fantasy drafts, you should only be looking for upside because you're just throwing darts at that point.
All right, Andy, who are your upside plays in the late rounds this year?
Yeah, I got to say I like JJ's call on Jonathan Stewart. There's always a bargain to be had on like last year's bums and boring vets that I've had Jonathan Stewart before, whatever. I've had Frank Gore before. I've had Steven Jackson. Guys in established roles who are kind of dull make the best fantasy values, especially in deeper leagues where you can feel secure about role. Now, a couple guys that we've already mentioned, Travis Kelce at the tight end position is a guy just absolutely blowing up in the preseason. Looks like a real threat. I mean, every game there's like a long highlight touchdown from this guy. He has all the physical traits you'd want. He's gigantic, right? It's a team that absolutely needs a receiving threat. So I think he's a really interesting play. I think Marquise Lee in Jacksonville a really interesting play. Somebody's got to be the number 1 receiver there. A couple of running backs, sticking with rookies, and I'm not like Mr. Rookie Collector or anything like that, but usually like a final round flyer. I'll take 1, I'll take 2. You used to be able to get Carlos Hyde very late in draft. Now he kind of goes in the middle because they've had so much injury trouble on the depth chart for San Francisco. But Carlos Hyde is a guy who we might be talking about him as like a 2nd round pick next year if he's the guy in San Francisco. And certainly if there's an injury to Frank Gore, Hyde is going to blow up. And then I like James White too. He was a kid who was just fantastic at Wisconsin. Now with New England, and you look at the running backs ahead of him. Do we think Shane Vereen is going to be a full workload running back? Probably not. So there's a role for James White there if Stephen Ridley fumbles that job away. And to my eye, Stephen Ridley is not really a special player anyway. They love going with a committee there. They're actually a very effective running team that often does it with 3 or 4 guys. So I can see James White working his way into that rotation early.
All right, Micah, any late round names we have not mentioned yet?
Its audio is kind of choppy. I think a player that I'm going to be targeting very late in my drafts is Bobby Rainey in Tampa Bay. With Charles Sims being out now for the bulk of the season, I think Rainey is a guy that even if Martin stays healthy, is going to have some fantasy value. I think that's probably going to be a 6-35 split. So Bobby Rainey is a name that a lot of people don't have on their radar yet. Another name, Cincinnati, for me, is going to be Mohamed Sanu. I know a lot of people were high on Marvin Jones given what he did last season, and certainly he had better fantasy production given all the touchdowns. But if you look at how the team numbers, Sanu was almost involved as Jones was. They were very, very similar, and now with Jones being hurt, Sanu is a guy that can step in and certainly early in the season provide flex value at least for your fantasy team, and he's somebody that you can pick up pretty late too. So those are guys that I'll be watching.
All right, so keep those names in your back pocket, but do not share them with your friends so that their ADP stays nice and low. Let's go to the opposite side of the equation here. Who are some guys in being drafted first or second round who you either don't like because you think they'll regress statistically, you're worried about injury, or you think the situation on their team has changed? Andy, who are some highly drafted players this year that will not end up on your team?
Well, a guy who would have been on my list, even before he was pinched for having like a loaf of marijuana in his car or whatever, was Le'Veon Bell, because he wasn't that good last year on a per carry basis. I have a problem paying the really expectant price on a player who, the year before kind of stumbled. It was 3.5 yards per carry last year. Had kind of a Trent Richardson vibe for me, right? A nice touchdown total, kind of saved the season. LeGarrette Blount was brought in there as maybe a potential committee member. LeGarrette Blount has been really good in 2 different NFL stops. So I was never convinced that Le'Veon Bell is going to have a full workload there. So I worry a lot about him, and he's a guy who goes first or second round. And then we talked about Rob Gronkowski, too. I mean, that's just a really tricky injury to come back from, and we have to have a little bit more respect for the difficulty of that rehab and the idea that, a guy can be incredibly explosive just 8-9 months after an ACL and a knee reconstruction is, if you're banking on second round production, that's tough.
All right, JJ, how about you?
One guy that I'm kind of avoiding, he has a third-round ADP right now, is C.J. Spiller. And a lot of that has to do with Fred Jackson more than anything else. I'm a huge Fred Jackson fan. Apparently, I just love geriatric running backs is what's really happening. But the thing with Fred Jackson, is the fact that, yeah, he's 33 years old. Yeah, he's up there in age. He also got a late start to his career in the NFL. And not only that, of the players in NFL history at the age of 32 that had 200-plus carries and 40-plus receptions, there's only 2 of them that have ever done that. One is Fred Jackson, and the other is Walter Payton. So just from a volume perspective, I'm not really sure that Fred Jackson is just going to disappear. The Bills showed signs that they like Fred Jackson. They extended his contract. They haven't really invested in C.J. Spiller at all. And I think that shows that they want to use Fred Jackson. He's their goal line back. He's going to be top 10 in the league in goal line touches this year, and he's being drafted at, I did a draft earlier this week, and he was my RB5, which is just absurd. I mean, I think, he was the number 10 running back in standard scoring leagues last year, and now because he's 33, because apparently when you go from age 32 to 33, your ADP drops 8 rounds at the end. So, from Fred Jackson's perspective, I love him, and just as a result of that, C.J. Spiller I think is a little bit overvalued because he's not going to get a ton of touches close to the goal line, and from a third round running back, I kind of want to have that touchdown upside. So I think C.J. Spiller is an electric player and he has a lot of potential, but I'm going to play a little bit conservatively in the early rounds of my draft.
All right, definitely, Micah. Anybody you think is currently being overdrafted won't be on your team?
CJ Spiller's on my list too, but even for some different reasons behind JJ. I think another guy that I'm really cautious about is Giovanni Bernard. You talk about some of these early round picks, and I love Bernard's talent. I mean, we all saw what he did in prime time last season. It looked like a video game on some of his runs, but I think there's this misconception that Hugh Jackson is going to bring in a run-specific offense, and I really think Cincinnati's going to throw a little bit more than people expect. I think Jeremy Hill is going to take a lot of the goal line work away from Bernard. If he falls to me in the late second round, I would have no problem taking him there, but I'm seeing him go in the end of the first, early second, and I'm going to get an elite wide receiver over Giovanni Bernard because I'm not convinced his usage this season is going to be enough to justify that price.
All right, thank you. So now I would normally not bring up defenses or kickers in a discussion like this, but I have to bring up this one thing because I've done some mock drafts where I have seen the Seattle Seahawks defense go as high as the 5th round. You know, we all saw them light it up in the postseason last year, and I think I know the answer to this. Is it worth reaching for an elite defense like the Seahawks, even if it's not that high, even if it's the 10th or 12th round? JJ?
No, it's not flat out. You know, one way to think of it, you know, there's this idea of streaming, which you can do with quarterbacks and tight ends, but defenses especially. People have been doing this for years in fantasy football. You play defenses based on matchups. So when I'm actually going into my drafts, I'm targeting a defense that has either a good week 1 matchup or just good early season matchups. So, you know, the Jets, for instance, are playing Oakland in week 1, and everyone wants to play a defense against Matt Schaub, let's be honest. You know, the Rams get Minnesota, and the Rams, it's, as a defense, are actually pretty solid. So, you know, from a week-to-week perspective, which is the way that you play fantasy football, you're not plugging in the Seahawks defense every single week. You don't have to plug in the defense that you draft every single week and say they have to perform like the Seahawks. You play a different defense each week. You know, last year we saw every defense in the NFL had at least 2 top 12 weeks, and the majority of them had between 4 and 7. The Seahawks had 9. And I say top 12, meaning that they were defensive 1 situations. You know, they were in a 12-team league. They were a usable defense. So just in general, there's a high turnover at defense each and every week. You can snag them off the waiver wire. There's no reason to get a team like Seattle necessarily, you know, in your fantasy draft, especially, you know, if they play a team like New Orleans in New Orleans, or if they play, you know, if there are rough matchups for them, you know, they're not going to produce for you, and it's just not worth an investment.
All right, judging from the head shakes when I ask that, I'm just going to assume the answer is uniform across the board on that one. So yes, do not draft the Seahawks defense in the 5th round. We are going to have to wrap it up here, but we'll do a couple more questions. Let's just quick, across the board, 30 seconds on who you would take with the #1 overall pick in a standard league and why. Andy.
Oh, for me, it's I mean, it's close, right? You can't go wrong with AP. You can't go wrong with McCoy. For me, it's Jamal Charles. I don't think people appreciate fully where he ranks just in terms of like all-time production, right? He's like the #2 running back in terms of yards per carry. And then last year, Andy Reid just basically unlocked, you know, the one thing that he didn't do as a fantasy asset, which was get goal line carries. He had 11 touchdowns last year from within the 3-yard line, right? So he's getting that work now. He's a threat for 2,000 scrimmage yards. That's my guy.
All right. Micah, Jamal Charles or someone else?
No, I've got concerns around Charles, and I have concern now with McCoy as toe issue. I love Norv Turner coming into Minnesota. I think we're going to see Adrian Peterson with a little bit of a resurgence. Right now, if I'm taking the first pick in the standard league, I'm going to take Adrian Peterson.
All right. JJ, agree with one of these guys, or are you going McCoy?
You know, it's definitely down to Charles or McCoy for me. I'll be contrarian and just say McCoy just to say it. But,
there we go.
Actually, you know, in a standard league, I do go McCoy over Jamal Charles. In a PPR league, I will go Jamal Charles because he has 70+ reception easily upside. With regards to McCoy, you know, his reception total could drop slightly potentially with a guy like Jordan Matthews who plays close to the line of scrimmage, and then Darren Sproles, obviously, who they got from New Orleans over the offseason. But McCoy's going to get a ton of volume. He's going to be able to score touchdowns. The Eagles are going to play an up-tempo style of offense, and that's why I think McCoy would be the guy in a standard league.
All right, so there's the case for each of the 3 people most commonly being drafted #1. Last question here, just in case there's anyone watching, say it's their first time doing fantasy football, first time drafting coming up. What would be your one piece of advice for someone who is a fantasy newbie? Micah, why don't you start us off?
Well, I'm going to do 1.5 because
Okay.
the very first piece of advice is get on Twitter and follow these gentlemen that are on this Google Hangout with me, because you're going to get great information from them. But beyond that, you are in your first fantasy football league. Here's the best rule of thumb I can give you. Wait until at least 75% of the other owners in your league have taken their quarterback before you draft yours. That's a good time frame to make sure you don't miss out, but I'm sure you don't get that early pick on a guy that's not going to pay off value.
All right. JJ, and you can't do the late round QB. One piece of advice.
Yeah, draft your quarterbacks late. No, I think the key, from a fantasy football perspective, is to take a step back and don't only look at player projections. Don't only look at the way a certain player is going to perform. Look at the way fantasy football as a game is constructed, and that's really going to show you why running backs and receivers get drafted early, and why that supply and demand situation comes to play in fantasy football, and how things are actually constructed. So don't pay. I mean, I'm not saying ignore player projections, because that would be stupid, but look at fantasy football from that higher level and see how things are constructed, and you can really find value that way in your fantasy drafts.
All right, good piece of advice. Andy?
Yeah, I guess my first piece of advice to a new player is to remember to stay active all year, right? I mean, with as much certainty as we talk about draft values and the way everybody's going to perform over the regular season, football, if you cover it for a few years, just like crushes you every year, right? I mean, the injuries rule the league, and uncertainty rules the league, and surprises, are the rule. They're not the exception at all. Almost every season, we see somebody who is among the absolute best fantasy scorers at the end of the season, most important weeks, emerge from the waiver wire, right? A guy that you could add at mid-season. So it's just imperative that you stay active and you don't just think that the team you draft is the team you're going to coast with all year.
All right. Well, we are out of time, but thank you all for joining us, and thank you to these three gentlemen for providing your expertise and insight. And good luck to everyone who's drafting. Thanks, guys.